Woman who never wanted to be First Lady revolutionized the role. More and more, Eleanor became the White House advocate for women, factory workers, tenant farmers, blacks, often pressing her husband to move faster than he was prepared to move.
Eleanor sent so many memos into his bedroom at night that after a while he had to create an Eleanor basket just to hold all these memos. And then after a while he had to make a deal with her saying, Eleanor, 3 memos a night, not 12, not 20, not 30. I will initial them and deal with them by morning. Sometimes she kept her bargain, but my sense is that more than 3 went in there many nights.
What they had together, my grandmother and grandfather, was what I call a creative tension. They both basically believed in the same things, but they had different roles to play. He had to work with the Congress. He was President of the United States, which meant not the liberals in the United States. It meant everybody in the United States. She was able to influence issues, and he was delighted. But he could also disown her, and did, with the press. You would say, well, you know my missus, I don't dictate what she says, or I don't control her. He was very charming about it. But in a way, it was just say, oh, she can say what she likes. That doesn't represent my position, which was very, very convenient. Very convenient for him to, through her, sense how far he could go.
By 1934, Roosevelt had been president for a year. Yet in spite of all his New Deal programs, hard times persisted.
The Depression was too deep. The origins, the roots of the problem were too deep.
The government had spent over $2 billion for relief, but thousands of new people were forced on the welfare rolls each day.
The numbers of people who are on welfare rise to 1/4 of an American city. One reporter in 1934 comes upon a couple living in a cave in Central Park in New York. And there was a sense that the New Deal, although it improved things greatly from the worst days of the Great Depression, was not really getting the country back to prosperous days again.
Despair turned to anger. Violent protests and strikes swept across the country. Bewildered and frightened, many Americans were drawn to agitators calling for reforms more radical than Roosevelt's.
I dared you and challenged you to organize so that the people, if not the president...
Father Charles Coughlin, a maverick Catholic priest from Detroit, turned radio into a pulpit from which he blasted the New Deal, demanding a living annual wage and nationalization of the banks.
Who then is the inflationist? Roosevelt or the National Union?
Francis Townsend, a retired California doctor, galvanized millions of supporters by advocating a plan for old age pensions. And Senator Huey Long from Louisiana, with his Share Our Wealth program, had his eye on the presidency. I can take him, Long said of Roosevelt. He's scared of me. I can outpromise him, and he knows it. His mother's watching him, and she won't let him go too far. He's living on an inherited income. People will believe me, and they won't believe him. Roosevelt's consensus was beginning to unravel. During the euphoria of his first 100 days in office, even Republicans had supported him. Now they turned against him.
The New Deal is government from above. It is based on the proposition that the people cannot manage their own affairs and that a government bureaucracy must manage for them.
Republicans charged that government was becoming too big and too intrusive.
We do not want to see these alphabetical bureaucratic agencies become permanent fixtures in our national political life.
Roosevelt grew increasingly frustrated as business began to accuse him of meddling with free enterprise. When he regulated the stock exchange and the banks, the captains of American industry were outraged.
They thought he had come in, he had done a very good job. Those first 100 days were all right, but now he should give us a chance to take back and run the country as we always had been accustomed to running it. He had a different idea about that.
With the election just 2 years away, the attacks on Roosevelt became more intense than ever. Angry businessmen founded the Liberty League, dedicated to stopping further New Deal legislation.
The discovery of what a political wizard he was what fired a lot of hatred of Roosevelt, because they'd thought of him as somebody they could manipulate, a splendid, well-meaning, rather genteel type. That's what they thought. Then they discover they have an absolute master politician, mischief maker, cunning man, and they hated him all the more because they'd been fooled.
Then, on May 27, 1935, a day New Dealers would remember as Black Monday, the Supreme Court struck at the very heart of Roosevelt's hope to stimulate the economy. They declared the NRA, the National Recovery Act, unconstitutional. And it was just the first blow. The court was moving against Roosevelt's efforts to abolish child labor, establish a minimum wage, boost farm prices. Law by law, the court would attempt to dismantle the work of the first 100 days. But with millions still unemployed, Roosevelt continued to use the power of the federal government to relieve the suffering caused by the Great Depression.
Congress, at Roosevelt's request, enacts the Emergency Work Relief Appropriations Act, which is the largest single peacetime appropriation in the history of this country or any country in the history of the world.
New York City, federal jobs for thousands at the rate of 100 a minute, while all over the nation work progress administrators are hurrying to transfer millions of idle from relief rolls to work payroll.
138 Green Street, New York, tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Municipal Building, Borough Hall, Brooklyn, tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock.
$5 billion went to the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. Men and women hired by the government worked on more than 5,000 schools, 2,500 hospitals, 1,000 landing fields, 13,000 playgrounds. Even artists went to work for the WPA. But for Roosevelt, this was just the beginning. He would bring power to rural America, where 9 out of every 10 families still lived without electricity. For millions of Americans, impoverished children, the unemployed, the elderly with no savings, the disabled, he offered the Social Security Act. He sold it as an insurance policy for everyone, but the poor, Roosevelt was saying, had rights too.
The great tradition in the United States had been private charity, community charity. Families take care of their own, and so the notion that somehow the government would take care of the poor or the unemployed or the old, this is something that was just not part of our tradition. We didn't know of it.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions, and through increased services for the protection of children and the prevention of ill health.
By the end of his first term, Roosevelt had begun to shift the balance of power in America. The rich felt the sting of higher taxes, and workers acquired the right to bargain collectively. Soon, great American industries, steel, rubber, automobiles, would be unionized for the first time. And the men FDR grew up with, who went to Groton and Harvard have begun to say that man in the White House has gone too far.
People from Franklin Roosevelt's class, when he first was elected, had no idea that he was going to do anything as radical as he did do. They really believed that because he was one of them, more or less, propertied and coming from old New York society, that the last thing that he would do would be anything that would cause anguish to his peers.
People who held a position in society that was basically inherited and family-oriented instinctively felt that this was being lost. And that man in the White House, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was responsible, and hence he was a traitor to his class. They hated him, and I know this from my personal experience of people who would come up to me, not just when my grandfather was alive, but for ever since, but particularly, say, in the 10 or 15 years after he died, and express their vitriolic hate towards Franklin D. Roosevelt in a way that is totally irrational.
A great yachtsman in Marblehead, Mass., Mr. Crowninshield, when on his entering in his logbook of his yacht a description of something really terrible, he referred to it as a Roosevelt. It was blowing an absolute Roosevelt that day, and the fog was thicker than a Roosevelt because he used the word Roosevelt. I mean, it seems ridiculous, but that was the extent to which these people took their hostility to the New Deal.
The rich and the privileged might hate him, but as his first term was drawing to a close, Roosevelt remained immensely popular with ordinary Americans. In spite of persistent hard times, the president had given them hope.
The most astounding thing was the pictures of Roosevelt you saw. Framed photographs, framed bad watercolors, good photographs, bad photographs, but everywhere. Bus stations, libraries, barbershops, homes. There were pictures of Roosevelt. I went into this lodge, and as we were checking in, I looked and saw this photograph, where the clerk was checking us in. And it was rather bad. It had been very bad color with sort of rouge cheeks. And I made a joke about this, the way they'd done him up. And we were thrown out. Now, that was the striking thing. It had nothing to do with partisanship. For the time being, the entire country decided he was the savior.